Shalom and welcome to another episode of Jerusalem Studio. It is almost 9 years since the first signs of upheaval in the Arab world emerged, starting with Tunisia and quickly spreading east to Egypt and other Middle Eastern countries. This was the so-called Arab Spring, which initially started as a democratic outpouring of popular sentiment, but soon deteriorated into chaos that altered the face of this volatile region. To discuss the current situation across this important part of the world, we are joined here in the studio by Dr. Joshua Krasna, who is a fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and a lecturer on Mideast security at NYU. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Dr. Menahem Merhavy, who is a research fellow at the Truman Institute at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding on the latest development pertaining to the upheaval across this region.
Well, you know, Jonathan, flying west from Tel Aviv towards, in this case, Madrid, one flies over the northern coast of Egypt, west towards Mersa Matruh, El Alamein of note, and then over the Gulf of Sidra, Libya, and Tunisia. Israelis do fly over Arab countries, Tunisia and part of Algeria, until one heads north towards Europe. And this reminds one, first of all, of the contiguity of all of these countries and how close they are to the heart of the Middle East, which is how the Levant sees itself, and also how it all started in Tunisia and spread out to other Arab countries, including Israel in the spring of 2011. This was also the popular protest here regarding society and the economy was also, in a way, a byproduct of the Arab Spring. And it seems so long ago, 8, almost 9 years ago, but if one looks back, many of these upheavals only caused chaos, civil wars, repression, counter coups, the way it happened in Egypt after the first euphoria of Mubarak being toppled, and then the elections with Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, and then, of course, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi coming back. And so what we see now is that most of these countries reverted to their old character. Wherever there was an authoritarian regime, it returned in one form or another. We haven't seen democracy take root at least in the Arab or Muslim Middle East.
Dr. Krasna, at the height of the so-called Arab Spring, which turned out to be quite bloody and created, of course, the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II, we established an analogy of the 1979 revolution in Iran, which was at the time, of course, where the middle class tried to make the difference in the country under the Shah government, and then the Islamists took over at the height of the situation because they were organized. Again, during 2011, in Egypt, we could see very clearly the middle class jumping into Tahrir Square, vocally demanding widespread reform. And when the election came after Mubarak was ousted, as Mr. Oren stated, we saw the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an organized entity, seizing the opportunity and taking away the people's hopes, if you will. Is this now the same phenomenon that is to be expected in Lebanon, for that matter, or Iraq, or elsewhere across the region, where we do now see legitimate public outcry for corruption allegations, for various challenges on the economic as well as medical and educational fronts? Is this something that will now be seized once more by radical Islamic organizations that are organized and ready for whatever lays ahead?
So I'm not sure. I don't think so. And I'll explain why, because I want to go back for a minute to Egypt and then explain why what's going on now is what's different than what happened 8-9 years ago. So first of all, in Egypt, when we said that the that the Muslim Brotherhood took power and oppressed the people, it may be true, but it took power in a democratic election. In other words, one of the things that they were the most organized political grouping. They were the most organized political grouping because the regime beforehand had been very careful about not letting any other democratic, popular groups developing. So the only group that had political power and had the political acumen was the one that had been spending all of those years keeping itself alive and therefore building up an organization which was both versatile and which was robust enough to then come out and be in charge. And they won the election because they were the best organized and because a lot of people, despite the fact that today in Egypt, because of the suppression of the Muslim Brotherhood, it appears that the Muslim Brotherhood is extremely unpopular. The Muslim Brotherhood was fairly popular before the elections. It was fairly popular during the Mubarak administration. But I think the difference between then and now is also has to do with something else as well. There's a reason the four countries that are in the second stage of the Arab Spring, which is Algeria, Sudan, and now Lebanon and Iraq, why they weren't involved in the first stage. And the reason was because in the first stage, all four of those countries had very recently come out of violence, had very recently come out of very, very bloody repression, had come out of changes of regime, as in Iraq. And therefore, unlike the other countries where nothing had changed for so long that there was this sort of fossilized system which wasn't delivering and had to be brought down. In those four countries in 2011, people were saying, well, we've already been there and we're not interested in doing this again. 8 years later, first of all, a lot of the people out in the streets don't remember what was in 2011 because they were kids then, right? The vast majority of the people in all four of these countries are very young. So they don't necessarily know what happened then, and their claims and the regimes that they're going against are on a very different reason than the reason that they went out yet, and that they went then. And in at least three of these countries, at least in Sudan, Lebanon, and Iraq, the regime that in one case was overthrown, the other two they're trying to overthrow, already has radical Muslim elements embedded in it. So when they are contesting the regime, they're actually contesting the groups that are the ones that you mentioned that we might be worried about them taking. So in Iraq, it's the pro-Iranian or not necessarily pro-Iranian Shia groups. In Lebanon, it's Hezbollah, and in Sudan, Omar Bashir went back and forth, but Omar Bashir at one point was a fundamentalist, right? He hasn't been for a long time, but at one point he was. So it's the people who are rising up for different reasons, and it's different people who are rising up against regimes that are quite different from the regimes that they rose up against then.
Not to forget also that in 2011, when the Muslim Brotherhood was capable of seizing the various political institutions, they are headquartered in the West. They're headquartered in London, which gives them a lot of leeway. They're under the coverage of Western powers and are able to maneuver differently than other organizations and local communities and populations, of course. But Dr. Merhavy, bringing Iran into the picture, there's of course also a lot of mayhem going on with protests and public unrest pertaining not only to the corruption of the Ayatollah regime, but also to various challenges on the economic front. Of course, the main reason for that is the American sanction regime that up until now has only ratcheted up week after week, month after month. To what degree do you see the various outbursts of protest, including in Iraq and Lebanon, where they are quite dominantly anti-Iranian because of the perceived Iranian influence in the country? Nevertheless, the ones that are most organized in those countries are Iranian-backed.
Right. So I think, yes, there is, of course, a side to the protests, both in Lebanon and even more so in Iraq, against Iranian involvement. But I think their main thrust is within the country, within home. That's really what it's about. Iran could meddle in other nations' deals, but it doesn't. It's not really the make and break in the sense of running these countries the way it sometimes I think is described in outside of Iran by its neighbors, by people in the West. I think the interesting situation is that in Iran you have a difference in the way the protests have developed, and that is one of the weaknesses actually of the protests in Iran, and that is that the economic and the political, I would say, do not interact so well. In other words, the protests against the economic situation is one thing. The political and freedoms, that whole issue of freedoms, hijab, etc., is a different one, and it's actually being managed and led by different groups within Iranian society. So the government actually, what it does to a large degree, is a divide and rule kind of thing of different sectors of Iranian society that are being played one against the other, in a quite impressive way, I should say, by the Islamic Republic. That is something that in the Arab world, as far as I can judge, is less, I would say, less easy to do. In other words, in the Arab world, the Arab protests, the political and the economic merge more easily into one protest. So, in other words, in Arab countries, in Iraq and Lebanon, it's quite obvious that the political and the economic, both problems emanate from the same thing, while in Iran, it's not that obvious. And I think Rouhani kind of tried to lead a very small thing like that, but I think he realized quite in an early stage that he could actually be hurt by that as well, because he's, after all, part of the system.
Mr. Oren, something that all those areas have in common is the points of friction are primarily areas where there is a difference of background. It's a very separatist outbreak, whether it is between the national aspirations of the public towards the local segregation aspects of Shiites versus Sunnis pertaining to Iraq, or Shiites, Sunnis, and Christians pertaining to Lebanon, and so on and so forth. To what degree do you see this as a national uprising as opposed to a religious one?
It is doubtful whether the concept of a nation state is really applicable to most of the Middle East, except for Egypt, which of course has thousands of years of culture and legacy, and Persia, now Iran, which is similar. Many other places are plagued by tribalism, by the religious wars, which you referred to. And we are probably, all of us, making a mistake by trying to look at the problems through a Western prism. Arabia is not Scandinavia. And even though, of course, the Swedes and the Norwegians and the others had their problems 100 years ago, 200 years ago, now they have a very good standard of living. They don't see what's to fight about. They don't have any territorial claims on each other. And this is not really what is happening in Iraq, which was only cobbled together by the British in the early 20th century. And there is really nothing which gives Kurds, Shiites around Basra and Sunnis around Baghdad any common identity, which was forced on them. And this is why, regretfully, one has to come back to the conclusion that there is hardly any prospect for democracy in these places. And the alternative to dictatorship or an authoritarian regime such as Saddam Hussein's is chaos and an invasion or influence by a neighboring country such as Iran in Iraq. And as Joshua mentioned, the youth bulge, the percentage of people who are coming into society, who are 24 years or less, who are not educated, are probably unemployed or underemployed. This is a phenomenon which is only going to get worse. So we can't come out of this discussion with any optimistic outlook.
Not to forget, of course, that a lot of those who have immigrated from those countries to Europe and elsewhere, to the democratic world, if you will, have exploited the democratic rules for their own values and for their own interests.
And there are problems with the scarcity of resources, water, fertile land.
Indeed.
It's only going to get worse.
Dr. Krasna, I'd like to ask you specifically with regard to the situation in Lebanon. To what degree is Lebanon resilient, considering the challenges that are quite stretching for many, many years? It's not Swiss d'Orient, as used to be stated back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. It is a nation of tribalism with hopes and aspirations for nationalism.
So I'll just say a word about the nation state, which Amir mentioned, which is in Europe and in Israel, because most of our states are nation states, we tend to think that that's the only kind of state that can survive. The United States is not a nation state. Neither is Great Britain. Neither is Russia. Neither is India. In other words, a state doesn't have to have only one nationality in it to survive. It's a question of how those nationalities get along. And that's in Lebanon, for instance, Lebanon is one of these states that is constantly being eulogized, but still doesn't die. As opposed to Iraq, where the sectarian system was sort of imposed fairly late on, in fact, in our lifetime, since 2003. In Lebanon, the sectarian divisions were sort of built in, hot-wired in when the state was first set up. In other words, Lebanon was built as a sectarian state for various reasons. So when the people...
When Lebanon was joined into Beirut and the other parts, which were unilateral, confession.
That's right. So, but Lebanon has changed enormously over the years in terms of its ethnic structure. But what's going on right now, I think, is not really ethnically or religiously based at all. Lebanon is probably has always probably been the most advanced Arab country. It's very westernized. The young people there see, like everywhere in the Arab world, see what's going on in the West, see how other people live, see how other people have gained independence, whether it's in the 90s in the former Yugoslavia, or whether it's in the color revolutions in the early 2000s, and even looking back at 2011, right? There are some bad lessons in 2011. There's some good lessons too. The big problem there, of course, is that while they don't like the system they have, there's no really convincing alternative system that anybody knows how to offer. So, they want to bring it down and make it a democratic system which is totally representative. Well, that's not going to happen, because the people who have to do that are the same people who are invested in the system that's today is surviving. Now, the young people who are out in the streets today are too young to remember what it was like before 1991.
Nevertheless, in contrast to Arab countries in the region or other Arab countries in the region, Lebanon is considered to be a relatively well-educated state.
Yes.
To what degree does this impact the so-called movement, which started with a sting campaign and then evolved into what we see today? To what degree can we see those youngsters who haven't really been impacted by the civil war or by other challenges that occurred during 2011 or before that, to really move forward and cross that threshold of a legitimate protest to a violent one?
Okay. So in the two examples that were successful in 2011, which is Tunisia and Egypt, right? Egypt was successful. The revolution was then, there was then a counter-revolution, but it was a successful revolution. In those two cases, the reason it was successful was that there was a fairly well-structured civil society in place that enabled people to organize quickly and enabled people to have, there were in Tunisia, there are very strong trade unions. Tunisia is a country which like Egypt and unlike other countries, is not really multi-ethnic. It has different ethnic votes, but it's not really multi-ethnic. And that enabled them, as didn't happen in Libya or Syria or Yemen, it enabled them to fairly quickly build political structures or build social structures that enabled the sort of amorphous unhappiness to be translated into a political agenda. I don't see that necessarily as existing in Lebanon. I don't see the person existing who knows how to take that and translate it into political system. And of course, in Lebanon, which is sort of a pseudo-democracy, there is no party that's then going to take that into elections and change the system from within. The system has to be changed from without, and the people who are on the street are not the ones who have power to change that.
May I make a comment regarding Lebanon?
Shortly.
In the early 80s, when Israel went in, it was lured by the Western outlook of the Phalange, the Jamals and others, educated, speaking French, behaving very elegantly, but they were also cruel and vicious, even to each other. So appearances can fool you.
Well, cruel is a word used by many in this small country, unfortunately. Dr. Merhavy, I'd like to move to Iran. Something that is very similar between Iran and Lebanon is both countries are relatively educated. Also, when we're talking about the middle class and the upper class, of course, but Iran has a lot of academic institutions, has a rich history that they're very proud of, but at the same time, the ones who support the regime are the poor. And which remains, as in every country, the poor are usually the majority of a state.
Right.
To what degree was this somewhat brief but still prolonged? I know that it's contradictory, but it's still ongoing protests in certain areas of Iran. To what degree was it by the educated middle class, knowing also that the poor are the ones who started the protests, even though the crackdown was less harsh on them because of their affiliation to the regime?
Right. So it actually has to do with that division I talked about earlier. That and that's one of the major weaknesses of the protest in Iran for the last, really on and off for the last 10 years, definitely in the last 3 years, that the poor people, as you said, or the blue collar, the workers, when they protest for just a better deal, better salary, better work conditions. They don't really care much about how the system is run, how the state runs, etc. They're not against the Islamic Republic. Actually, most protesters, including the young people who go against the hijab, they don't want to topple the Islamic Republic. I know that's the impression you often get from the way it's covered in Western media. Many of them don't really want to topple the whole system. They just want a better deal. And Rouhani, in a way, speaks in the name of those young, educated people, as you said, saying, for example, the Revolutionary Guards are they're too prevalent. You see them too much on the streets. That's basically the message, And they should just play down their role. They should play down their role in the economy. That's another thorny issue in Iran. But that's what I'm saying, that I do not see the poor, the masses, the urban masses especially, the ones who brought about the Islamic Revolution in 1709. I do not see anything even close to that happening anytime soon in Iran.
And we saw Iran being, or we defined Iran as the big winner several years ago of the Syrian civil war and different aspects. And it seemed that up until the sparks of protests in Iraq, it seemed like Iran was in control. Now, slowly, things are changing with very strong anti-Iranian sentiment in the streets of Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, yes, even Syria. To what degree do you see this as alarming for the Iranian regime? And are they actually establishing countermeasures to try and reassert their dominance in the region?
So again, I would like to ameliorate both impressions you made. I mean, they were not in such a perfect control the way it seemed before, and they're not in such a bad shape now. I would take it on both sides. In other words, Iran, the way Iran sees it, it's not we control the region or we want to control the region. It's more about we want to create a certain front that will be on our side, for example, in a situation of collision with the West. And in the long term, we want a more Shiite-oriented region. And they are working on it in Syria, for example, by dua, by people who actually proselytize Shiite Islam. So that's a long-term program.
So we're drawing near to the end of the program, and I'd like to give each and every one of you the opportunity to actually provide an outlook on the way Israel should deal with the situation. Mr. Oren, we'll start with you.
Yes, the most interesting experiment which is going on has to do with the Palestinians, both the Palestinian Authority under Fatah and Gaza under Hamas, because these millions of Arabs have been closely linked to Israel, either under occupation or as neighbors, have learned from its democratic ways, the last year not being the perfect example regarding how to run a country, how to use democracy to elect a government. But nevertheless, they are Israel's best pupils. And it's interesting to see the way the Palestinian Authority evolved under Arafat first, then when Hamas won the parliamentary elections after Arafat, and what is happening now between Gaza and the West Bank.
Indeed, Dr. Krasna, on the Israeli approach towards the regional Arab countries, Lebanon, Iraq, and so on?
So I'll just say that one of the lessons we've learned from 2011 and since is that the fact that somebody doesn't like our enemies doesn't mean that they're our friends. And the people who are on the streets in Lebanon and Iraq are not people who particularly like Israel either. One of the mistakes that we might make is to think that democratizing or popular organizations in the Arab world are good because they don't like our enemies, but they're not really crazy about us either.
Dr. Merhavy, on the Iranian front, to what degree do you see the Israeli involvement or the Western involvement actually taking the right measures?
So I think there is a certain door of opportunity here that opens to Israel for this, yes, to do something about this anti-Iranian sentiment. As much as it's not really in our power to control it, it's definitely something that we could use to our benefit.
Well, contrary to historic quotes, the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend. This is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Dr. Krasna, Mr. Oren, and Dr. Merhavy for being with us here today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.